Hello there, everyone. Back with what should be the fourth and final installment of Global Politics in the Modern Era. At the very least, I'm hoping that this lecture brings us up to the very late 80s and the very early 90s. If that happens, it will have accomplished its purpose, and it should give us a pretty sturdy background to rely on throughout the rest of the semester some subjects we'll talk more about history than others. I know that one of the topics we're going into very soon is the topic of nuclear weapons. There's actually quite a bit of Cold War history in that nuclear arms race, so that is coming. But I think that the preponderance of information for the rest of the semester, try to keep it a little bit more recent because we do teach issues, but we also talk about theory and history, and so we're never going to entirely get away from this, but I'm trying to give you some sense as to kind of how we got to the present 30 years or so. So last time moved slow as usual and only made it up to about 1950. And so I've taken all the stuff that was left off of that. I've plugged it onto here, and I've added, I think, just 2 points at the end, although the last two they usually take a while, but I'll see how I'm doing on time with this one, and I'll go from there. As always, office hours 4 days a week. If you have any questions about the substance of the material, if you haven't finished the last set of readings on the history, the Chapter 2 stuff, then you ought to make sure that you have that done. But that is it. I'm going to get into it. If you recall from the previous lecture that I did, we started talking about the early Cold War, and one of the ideas in American foreign policy was this idea of containment. That's the name that's given for a number of policies the United States used throughout the Cold War as part of its, we talk about grand strategy with respect to the Soviet Union. The ideas, containment was always a kind of multi-pronged approach. I think a lot of times in readings and even talking about containment, it's easy to overemphasize the military component of containment. And I would say even this lecture mostly does that. But really, containment was largely a political, diplomatic, and I would say economic. It used those policies more than it tended to rely on the use of force. We tend to focus on the uses of force because those tend to come after the economic, diplomatic, and political efforts failed. There's the old idea from media and the news: if it bleeds, it leads. And so I think we tend to focus a bit too much on the fighting, and it's worth reiterating some points that I was trying to raise last time, and just to keep them in the back of your mind. The creation of the United Nations, as I mentioned, was really something kind of new and different. Certainly that was not in keeping with traditional American foreign policy, which avoided any sort of open-ended commitments during peacetime. And the United Nations would, I don't know if I'd say theoretically, but plausibly could put the United States in a war in which it was neither an aggressor nor the victim of aggression, neither allied with the aggressor or a victim of aggression. And that was a bit strange and did not keep with George Washington's advice in his famous farewell. It's just called the Farewell Address, 1796, in which he generally urges Americans to avoid those kind of open-ended commitments. The idea of foreign entangling alliances comes on the heels of Washington's advice. But this was new and different. But the United Nations, while it didn't exclude the Soviet Union joined it, was in fact a pretty prominent member within it. The values that are embedded in the United Nations, peaceful resolution of disputes, protection of human rights, those are certainly in keeping with, not opposed to, American foreign policy goals, and we're not necessarily aligned with the Soviet Union's goals. But that's that. I'm not doing the entire history of the United Nations today. I have a separate lecture where I'm going to talk about various international organizations, including the UN. I mentioned briefly, I seem to recall, the creation of the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the precursor to the World Trade Organization. It was known as the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade. Regional organizations, such as the Organization of American States, large treaty organizations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization itself, NATO. Just the kind of frenzied pace of international institution making and international joining and leading for the United States was really not in keeping with its past tendencies, not at all. Again, it's always easy if you don't know what you're talking about to say that things never change. But boy, oh boy, were they changing at the end of in the period from the end of the Second World War going into what we know as the Cold War. Cold War doesn't have any hard start date. Some people say it started actually at the end of the Second World War. Others put it in 1946. Others 1949. It doesn't really matter. I would say broadly it's just the period of the post-war. So late 1945 to about 1991 seems about right, and we can let others quibble about the exact days, months, and the year when it starts. But that's what we're talking about. Things are changing. And we're not just focused on American foreign policy, but in this period there are two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So knowing something about American foreign policy and why it's the way it is should give you some insight into how global politics unfolds. And I'm stressing it because it really was new and different, at least in the eyes of George Kennan, who I talked a fair amount about in the previous lecture. Soviet foreign policy, although there was the kind of communist ideology that needed to be paid at least lip service to. Excuse me. For Kennan, the Soviet Union didn't really act all that much different than the old Tsarist Russia. It just now had far fewer other great powers to constrain it. And if the United States was not willing to, there was a good chance that it was going to seek to influence, if not control outright, far more territory than it had at the end of the Second World War. And from one of the maps I had up last time, I hope you'll recall that the Soviet Union ends the war considerably larger, more influential than when it started. So I am transitioning back to the outline. If you didn't see it before, this is what we were up to. Move right over here. So, the Korean War. In some ways, it's kind of new and different. And in other ways, it was not all that similar to the things I left off the last lecture talking about. So, I briefly recounted several instances where the United States perceived that the Soviet Union and, don't know what happened there, and forces of global communism were testing Western and specifically American resolve as to whether they were really going to stand up and contain the Soviet Union or if they would kind of fold over with just a little bit of pressure. Without talking any more about those, because I feel they were sufficiently covered, this is another one of those, although the intensity, it's a full-on war, though it's not a direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union. And I suppose that this is also not a bad time to remind everyone that it's called a Cold War because there really wasn't a full-on war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a lot of wars by proxy. It was a lot of fighting the other side's proxy rather than fighting them directly. And Korea is, I would say, the kind of first hot battle of the Cold War. Very brief background. So remember that Korea, well, I don't know if you remember, but if you do, and if not, you're about to learn it, Korea had been formerly occupied by Japan and it was retaken with the end of the Second World War. And the victorious powers didn't really know what to, they weren't entirely sure what should become of Korea. There was some sense that, self-determination, Koreans should decide for themselves what they want to do. And so there was a kind of temporary boundary that was set up. You can see right here, it's the 38th parallel. There was a regime in North Korea on China's borders, and then there was another regime in South Korea. They were supposed to hold elections and agree to unification. That did not happen. And I guess I'll briefly just give you the background of this. So North Korea ended up becoming a communist regime. Remember that in 1949, its large neighbor to the north also went communist as a result of the Chinese Civil War. Remember also that a bit further north, a little bit east, you have the Soviet Union. And in the south, you didn't have a democracy, so don't think it's that. But you had a non-communist regime that was governed by the aging nationalist Syngman Rhee, R-H-E-E. In any event, some people blame a poor American speech that was given. United States top diplomat was giving a speech talking about the American Pacific perimeter and all the allies and the occupations we had going on in 1950, and identified several specific entities. He left out South Korea, and the communist world interpreted that as South Korea was not that important to the United States, and the communist regime in the North saw an opportunity, rather than to risk election, to unify the Korean Peninsula through force. And so that's the first, you got four panels here. This leftmost panel is the initial invasion. And you can see that Northern forces initially almost push South Korean and other forces into the sea. There's just this one little pocket left in the kind of southeast corner that holds out. Then, well, I should say before the second panel happens here, the United States acts within the United Nations, and the United States quickly passes resolutions in the Security Council with the aid of other members, naming North Korea an aggressor and authorizing the use of force to repel that aggression. Aggression was against the UN Charter. While that was happening, by the way, U.S. fleet was already sailing to Korea, and so the message was clear. The United States was going to intervene, and the UN could either join and make itself look relevant, or it wouldn't. And the United States would do it on its own. Because in the United States, this was the Truman administration still, the perception was that this wasn't a North Korean attack against South Korea in an attempt to unify the peninsula through force. The view was that this was the Soviet Union testing the United States. Was the U.S. going to stand up to an apparent breach of containment? What we thought of as containment, or would we back down? Up until this point, it had mostly been aid, Berlin airlift, those kinds of measures, which usually, they all stopped short of the U.S. fully committing into a war. This was on a much larger scale. And so that element of it is different than the previous tests of containment. Excuse me. All right. Why didn't the Soviet Union stop those resolutions? If you know a little bit about the Security Council of the United Nations, you know there are 5 countries that all have to agree to a resolution, and if any of them votes no, the resolution fails. So why didn't the Soviet Union just vote no so that the UN couldn't authorize these actions against communist ally North Korea? The answer is that the Soviets, it's kind of one of those accidents of history, was protesting and boycotting the Security Council meetings because the Security Council was still seating the nationalist Chinese representatives, the folks who were aligned with Chiang Kai-shek. You read about him. I talked about him briefly. And the Soviet delegates believed that it ought to be the mainland China, the communist Chinese government's delegate. And so they were angry at the UN for doing this. And so to show their displeasure, they left. They should have been there. They weren't. One of the many times where it makes more sense to stay in, even if you don't like how things are going, rather than cede the field to others. So the Soviet Union's not there to stop those resolutions. UN authorizes force. So there's the kind of UN flag and all that. But it's mostly an American-led operation. As the panel correctly shows, the strategy was not to land in and around the Pusan pocket. It was to land behind communist forces. You can see that they have Seoul today is the capital of South Korea. Land behind the North Korean forces, cut off their supply lines, which would force them to rout, and then advance north. The advancing north bit was not part of the UN mission. The UN mission was just about repelling the aggression, pushing the lines back to where they had began. While here, U.S. forces, really UN forces, but they're really U.S. forces, led by Douglas MacArthur of World War II fame, decides that he's going to go a bit beyond the 38th parallel, and now the United States sees, because they've routed North Korean forces, that, there's also an opportunity to unify the Korean Peninsula, but we're not going to do it under North Korean auspices. We're going to do it under South Korean and UN and American auspices. All right, well, that's an idea. If you can see the third panel, you can see it didn't go well. What happened? Well, what's nice about this panel is they label the Yalu River, the kind of natural border between China and Korea. China was not, right? China had just gone communist. The communist government had just won its civil war the previous year, seizing mainland China. It did not want a pro-U.S. or actual U.S. bases in a U.S. ally on its borders. And so 200,000 Chinese quote-unquote volunteers, because China didn't want to be seen as launching a war against the United States. They wanted some plausible deniability and say that these were really Chinese volunteers helping the North Koreans. Yeah, right. And they overtake American forces. In the second panel, what they can't show you, because there's only so much, is that the advance northward from Seoul was very rapid. So rapid, in fact, the advancing forces, the lead forces, outran their supplies. And so they kind of pulled themselves apart in advancing so rapidly, and they were overrun by these now North Korean forces backed by these Chinese quote-unquote volunteers, and they're going to overrun mostly the American positions, and that's going to cause them to fall back. You can see it's the fallbacks south of Seoul, and then in a kind of counterattack, there is about where the lines stabilize. And most of this is done in about the first year of fighting. And after that, there's about 2 more years where these lines don't move very much at all. And the capitals of North and South Korea are so close to one another even today. Those are the capitals of the two countries today. The way this ends is actually is affected by American domestic politics. And so yet again, what goes on inside of countries does sometimes affect foreign policy and global politics, and the other is also frequently true. Dwight David Eisenhower wins the American presidential election in 1952, defeats Adlai Stevenson. Anyways, Eisenhower wins in November 52 and makes it clear to the Chinese in particular, kind of bypassing the North Koreans, because it was clear who the power was behind North Korea. Eisenhower threatened to use nuclear weapons if the Chinese did not negotiate a peace. Eisenhower didn't want this war continuing to drag on in Korea, and he was either going to dramatically escalate it by the introduction of nuclear weapons, or was willing to go with an armistice to get the fighting over. And the Chinese and the Soviets leaned on the North Koreans and said, we're going to do an armistice, or more like, you're going to go do an armistice. And that's what we have in the Korean War. An armistice, by the way, is a ceasefire. Right? It's a halt to the operations. It's not the end of the war. And in fact, there is no final peace agreement. Here we are sitting in 2021. This armistice, the details are finally hammered out. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I got the capitals wrong. I misread this. The armistice is called the Panmunjom Armistice Agreement. Pyongyang is further north. That's the capital of North Korea. I apologize for misspeaking, and hope I didn't throw anyone too much for a loop. But yeah, Panmunjom is the 1954 Armistice Agreement. Pyongyang is the capital of North Korea, further north. All right, with all that done, this is over. What's the kind of takeaway? There's a mixed reaction in the United States. Some who are, I guess I would say, those who are a bit more attuned to global politics, they see this as a success, right? The policy was, don't let the communist world expand, right, in any way. They attempted in this case to expand by force. It required counterforce. That was done, and, mission accomplished. The wider perception, say in the American public, was not so glowing. To many, World War I, World War II. What do you mean a ceasefire? The United States doesn't do ceasefires. The United States does unconditional surrender. We win, the other side loses, and we dictate the terms of the peace. And that didn't happen. Well, it didn't happen. That was not the goal. It was a bit complicated for some. So, anyways, there are those kind of different reactions. But overall, the sense was, this is another test. We passed it, and let's make sure we're ready for the next one. All right, I try as much as I can without forgetting to talk about the role of ideas, and I guess I had to spell it out here to show you that I'm really thinking about it. But certainly, I mean, if not ideas, what animates people. But it's worth mentioning that in the United States, there was an idea that gripped many American policymakers, those at the top, when it came to foreign policy, and it was wrong. It was wrong from the beginning, but they were nonetheless convinced it was true. The idea might sound a little bit daunting, monolithic communism? Here, I'll give you the idea. If it sounds daunting, it's not that hard of an idea. Here we go. We'll say all communist movements everywhere are led, directed, and supervised by... Okay, that's the Soviet Union. That was what American policymakers believed was true. Monolithic means all of one. Communism is communism. And so, and that idea comes about wow, some people have been thinking of it for a while, but 1950 is usually the date that we give to this. And it coincides with the start of the Korean War. And it's going to influence American foreign policy making for almost the next 20 years. And it would really blind policymakers to opportunities they would not see. So for example, just going back to my map here, all right, we see China, which had gone communist, and we can't really see much of the Soviet Union. And we assumed, well, one communist, two communists, they're all in it together. And North Koreans, and they're all in it together. That was not true. Mao, when he and Stalin were alive, both pretty big egos, and they weren't going to dance to the tune that the other one was calling. I mean, there was certainly a rhetorical commitment for communist solidarity, but in fact what actually happened is that the communist Chinese and the communist Soviets, rather than cooperating in a lot of instances, they began to rival one another. And this rivalry would play out later in the Cold War. Particularly, we're going to see it in the 1970s. Should it be the Chinese path of communism, or should it be the Soviet path of communism? And they would each try to one-up the other. But these divisions really weren't clear to most until the 1970s. The Soviet Union promised to help the Chinese build atomic weapons. They really did not. They're actually going to fight a brief border skirmish. It's probably too much to call it a war, but there's going to be some fighting between the Soviet Union and Soviet China in 1968 over a border in Central Asia. So all is not well, but the United States fails to detect it, and it's really going to blow up in our face. I'm really foreshadowing here Vietnam, because what American policymakers did not understand is that the communists in Vietnam, though they were communists, historically the Chinese had been the Vietnamese rivals and were not likely to be particularly deferential to the Chinese. And they were in no rush to become the puppets of the Soviet Union. The communists in Vietnam, as was sometimes the case with communists elsewhere, were not internationalists. They were nationalists and communists, or maybe they were nationalists who happened to have been communist, but they were for independent Vietnam, first from the French, later from American influence, and later they're going to assert themselves against undue influence from other communist powers. Independence is independence is independence. But we didn't see that, we being the United States, did not see that getting, as we got into the war in the 1960s, and by the time Kissinger and Nixon start to grasp this, the United States is already in, and the prestige is on the line, and they convinced themselves they could not just pull out. And, well, we'll talk about Vietnam when we get there. But, all the, maybe they were the smartest people in the room. Maybe they certainly had better information than, my equivalent or your equivalent at that time. But they just got this wrong. And once you get the major idea wrong, this becomes the assumption. It's hard to get a lot of the policies under it right. And so, as I try to do, one of the many, many other things I try to do is to let you know that the experts frequently get it wrong. And nonetheless, we continue to look to them to get it right in the future, despite having been wrong in the past. So anyways, that's an idea. It matters because it animates American foreign policy, and we care about American foreign policy in a class on global politics because it's one of the two major superpowers, and we're largely studying in this course the role of great powers and other things, but a lot about the great powers. All right, the French withdrawal from Indochina and America's war in Vietnam. Let me grab a drink and I'll be right back. All right, the beginning of America's long war in Vietnam. There's nothing great about it on this source. It's worth reminding ourselves, and I haven't done it so much yet in this course in Unit 1, but there's a lot of good free information out there, and so I'm not going to read it to you, don't worry. But the State Department, among many other sources, the United Nations frequently has a lot of good information as well. Maybe I'll try to model that in some of the later assignments without making it too onerous. But there's a lot of high-quality free information, and it's worth getting at. So if you want the long story, you can do all this. I'm not going to give you the long story. Well, it may feel like the long story, but I'm actually not giving you the long story. Trust me on that. So, much of what we refer to as Southeast Asia today was formerly French Indochina. In fact, during World War II, the Japanese had actually displaced the French from Indochina, and a number of groups fought, Vietnamese included, to get rid of the Japanese. The French, though weakened by World War II, attempted to assert control over Vietnam in the mid and late 1940s and the early 1950s. The French eventually run into some problems up north. A place called Dien Bien Phu. I'm not a military mastermind, but the French end up getting themselves stuck in an area, and all the surrounding heights are taken by members of the Vietnamese independence forces. That's the Battle of Dien Bien Phu. The French surrender. I mean, that's the long and the short of it. Before the French surrendered, though, they had been gradually pulling the United States into this war. They played down the whole anti-colonial thing because they knew that the United States historically has always sympathized with people who are fighting against colonialism. Oh, there it is. All right. Okay, there's Dien Bien Phu. So it's, you just kind of keep your eye right where that mouse cursor is. It's pretty far inland. It's a bad place to get stuck in, a great place for a trap. So anyways, that happens. But before the French leave, they've been convincing the United States that, and they're aware that this idea has taken over, and the French are really playing up the communist aspect and not playing up the independence anti-colonial aspect of Vietnamese resistance, because they're looking just north of Vietnam, not just north, but a little ways. If you need a reference, right? This is going on in the early 50s. Up here in Korea, we have that Korean War I was just talking about. And so, let me zoom out just for some points of reference where we are in the the world if you're not familiar. If you haven't studied those maps in your book, you should. Maps are great reference tools in this class. And they're hoping the United States will subsidize their operations in Indochina. The United States actually does commit quite a bit of money to the French effort. The French try to get the Americans to use nuclear weapons and otherwise get militarily involved in their war. That the United States is not going to do, and we don't. And so the French get out, and there is a peace agreement. The country is going to be, we'll just zoom in here, the country is going to be divided in half, a north half and a south half. And see if this sounds familiar. It's going to be temporary, and eventually it will be unified through elections. That's the plan. And the Chinese are there, the Soviets are there, the Americans are there, and all right, that's the plan, I guess. Okay. For U.S. foreign policy, there's a problem. The leader of the Vietnamese resistance, who happens to be residing in what comes to be the communist North, we know him by his nom de guerre, Ho Chi Minh. But he is the leader. He's very popular throughout the country. He's anti-colonial, he's nationalist, but he's also communist. He actually spent time in France, traveled a fair amount. He actually, in reading the Vietnamese Declaration of Independence from the French back in the 40s, starts off by quoting some of the lines from the Declaration of Independence to actually try to get American support. That didn't work out, but he was not staunchly anti-American at that point. Excuse me. But the United States is not interested in democratic elections in Vietnam. It can't come out and say that because it doesn't want to bear the blame for what's going to happen next. But the Americans know, as everyone knows, if there are free and fair elections north and south, they're all going to vote for Ho Chi Minh and the Communist Party, and that's how Vietnam is going to be unified. It's going to be unified under communist rule. And there's, I didn't put it in the outline, but since I'm doing this, I can just do it now. I'll put it here. It actually doesn't start this early, but I'm thinking of it, so we'll put it in quotes. This was linked to containment. Actually, Domino Theory started out back in the 40s, is some of the earliest references I found. And the idea was used early on to justify massive foreign aid to European countries for the fear that if one non-communist country went communist, then another, like dominoes, you set one up and you knock it down, and then it knocks another one, and so on. Like I think you understand what I'm talking about. Well, that believe it or not, that simple idea it is actually what American policymakers, they were men who were supposed to know better, they kind of made that analogy to foreign policy. They had done it previously in Europe, and then they just applied it, right? Because people go with what they know. They applied it to Southeast Asia, and they said, well, China's already gone. Now, if Vietnam goes all communist, then certainly Laos, and actually in the 50s and into the 60s, well, even into the 70s, Laos was kind of half communist, half non-communist. If this story sounds familiar, don't stop me. This is a recorded video. You can't. But there was a very interesting set of parties in conflict with each other in Laos, but the concern was that with Vietnam fully communist, they could throw their weight in support of the communists in Laos, and all of Laos would go communist, and that could potentially roll over Cambodia, possibly Thailand, all of Southeast Asia, and then and then the dominoes would, going along with this theory, they would somehow leapfrog this water. There are no great naval powers here, but somehow it would leapfrog this water, and the American, perimeter, so-called perimeter in the Pacific, consisted of the bases in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines, and Australia. Indonesia ended up being pretty pro-U.S. It's also an interesting story. It's also one of the people forget that Indonesia, I believe, is the fourth most populous country in the world still. People know, China, India, the United States, and then it's like, who's number 4? I'm pretty sure it's still Indonesia. Anyways, lots of islands, and New Zealand in the south. So there's this string of islands in the Pacific, right off the east coast of Asia, that are pro-American. And the concern is that if Southeast Asia goes, this is what I don't understand, is how they thought this was going to cause a flip in the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea, and Taiwan. I don't know. I mean, there is a concern that down here, so this is one of the most more strategic straits in the world. It's called the Malacca Strait. You have a lot of fossil fuels, and you have a lot of trade that passes through the Malacca Strait. You can see it passes the city-state there of Singapore, usually before a lot of that trade then goes north into mainland Asia. Perhaps that was part of it, but yeah, there are leaps of logic here that I don't even really follow. But just so you know, that's what they were thinking, or that's how far they were thinking. French are gone, temporary division, supposed to be unified by democratic elections, but the United States is going to see to it that South Vietnam, if at all possible, does not participate. If they can't find their own popular leader who could rival or beat Ho Chi Minh, then they're just going to pull out of the elections altogether. More domestic politics, and I think that this is another example of how the domestic affects the international. Again, that term, the term is used to refer to both domestic politics affecting international politics. I guess that's what this is an example of. And then sometimes there's the kind of foreign policy that influences the domestic policy. Actually, McCarthyism is a good example of kind of both sides of intermestic, because McCarthyism and the second Red Scare, if you're not familiar, let me just grab a drink here. Joseph McCarthy was one of the least popular and admired senators in the United States Senate. And he was coming up for re-election. He really didn't have an issue that was going to resonate with voters. And so in front of a women's Republican club in Wheeling, West Virginia, he claims to have in his pocket, when he's giving the speech, the names of 205, he claims, card-carrying members of the Communist Party. I always make a terrible joke that I didn't know they gave out cards for that. That would seem to kind of defeat the purpose in the United States of being secret. Like, if you give out a card, how do you deny that? And who checks them? But anyways, I wasn't there to ask these questions. So I'm sure that's why this went along. And what's this about? There are communists in the State Department? 205 communists? Well, that's what he claimed. And he was, by the way, guys, he was making this up. I'll just tell you how it ends. There was nothing. He was just making it up. Later, so for example, he later settles that, okay, it's not 205, it's 57. And he was told to go with 57. And you can't make up this stuff. If you're sitting there like, why 57? Go get a bottle of Heinz ketchup. I don't know if they put it on the plastic ones, but they used to have it on the glass ones. I don't even know if they make them. And look on it, and you'll see 57 on there. They claimed, again, this is advertising for you, that there are 57 varieties of Heinz ketchup, and it was a popular slogan. It was everybody knew 57 and they could remember it. And so he says that there are 57. Sorry, it's a little funny when you think about it. Communists who have infiltrated the State Department, and the communists are subverting American foreign policy from within because American government's been infiltrated. I laugh, but then I look at the last few years and, we have not come a long way in getting away from baseless conspiracy theories. Anyways, it launches a pretty intense, about a 3-year investigation to find out who the communists were in government. That didn't go so far, so they mostly went after Hollywood types, right? The elites that so many like to ascribe everything that's wrong with their lives to today. Entertainment elites and so on, movie stars, so forth. We shouldn't forget that a number of prominent would-be or later politicians or prominent actors rolled over on a number of their former apparent friends, but I guess not friends like those. But he ruined a lot of lives, claiming that there was some sort of broad conspiracy theory. Why was this believable? Well, you got to remember the series of foreign policy events that happened right before McCarthy, and right as McCarthy is saying all this. The Soviet Union gets an atomic bomb much faster than U.S. intelligence predicted. Why? Well, McCarthy has an explanation. They're being fed the information through spies. That was actually true, but they weren't the high-level spies that were making policy at the State Department that McCarthy thought. These were spies, and the Soviets had infiltrated the Manhattan Project back when it was underway during World War II. Thoroughly infiltrated it. When Harry Truman takes over for Roosevelt, when Roosevelt dies, Joseph Stalin knows more about America's atomic bomb than the American president, because Roosevelt didn't tell Truman pretty much anything. And that really hampered the transition, but Truman did probably as well as anybody would have in that situation. But I digress. So that happened. The Chinese Communists won, to everybody's surprise. Everybody who wasn't studying and watching the Civil War closely was surprised. People who were watching the war and knew the actors were not at all surprised the nationalists lost. They were terrible governors, not particularly effective militarily. Lots of corruption, which hindered them both on the military, but really on the governance front. And so it was not a surprise they lost the support of the people. But most Americans didn't know that, and that wasn't an interesting story. The interesting story is, we've been sold out. McCarthy is really using the old Adolf Hitler stab in the back thesis that, we would have won in China if not for being undermined by some group. McCarthy has slightly different targets than Hitler, but it's not that new. It's not like we haven't been here before. Couple that with what appears to be Soviet aggressiveness in Europe, and now what appeared right in 1950 and 51 to be communist aggression in North Korea. That could be Soviet and Chinese. It appeared to many Americans that we were losing. We were on the back foot, and Joseph McCarthy had an explanation. The reason why we were losing is because our government and the entertainment industry were just flooded with communists. While it's entirely baseless, it does create a kind of hysteria that the United States is prone to going through. Of course, we are known for our witch hunts. Well, not Poughkeepsie so much, but the United States and we'll say Salem and among other places are known for witch hunts. But it's indicative of a kind of panic. There was one right after the end of the First World War. This was the first Red Scare. That was actually part of a larger anti-immigrant backlash. It was a little bit easier, especially during the Depression of 1921, and other parts of the economy were hurting. So it was easy to scapegoat immigrants, as we've done. But no, this one created a kind of general fear that communists were like everywhere. The kind of domestic politics and how it like boomerangs back out to the foreign arena is that Democrats in particular are sensitive to the label that they're soft on communism. For whatever reason, despite the Democratic propensity, and I mean the Democratic Party, for beginning wars, or at least fighting them against communists, among others, they seem hesitant. They seem, for some reason, they're not appearing strong enough on some issue. For some reason, it was okay to suggest that Democrats were soft on communism, but not Republicans. Anyways, Democrats are going to show just how tough they are. Whenever they're in power, whenever they have the opportunity, they're going to stand up to communists. All right, a little bit of intermestic, a little bit about McCarthyism, and a little bit about the Domino Theory. Certainly in the case of McCarthyism, Domino Theory, and monolithic communism, the role of ideas is super important. This point explains itself. I know I've run long on time, so if it doesn't really need to be explained, I'll just point it out. Stalin dies, and Nikita Khrushchev eventually succeeds him and ends up governing until 1964. 1955, 5-5, okay. The counterpart to NATO, this is the kind of Soviet Union version of NATO. It's called the Warsaw Pact, and I think I saw something on here about that. There's all this other stuff too that I did. Okay, Warsaw Treaty Organization. So that's what that is. Yeah, if you want to get all the details that I have to leave out because of digression, go ahead and get on that State Department page. So now the Soviet Union has its own. Again, without the Soviet Union, the group is largely meaningless. But there it is. In the Warsaw Pact does crumble. Unlike NATO, which continues to exist on its own. Was there anything on here for this new one? Yeah, it has the Bandung Conference, which is largely viewed as the kind of start of what's known as the non-aligned movement. Very, very interesting. But I think... So the non-aligned movement really refers to former colonial countries, not these, okay, not those. Not that. The non-aligned movement is a grouping of countries who were either colonized or they were non-Western, and they didn't want to choose the U.S. side or the Soviet Union side. France, for its own reason, which I'll mention, also wanted to find a kind of third way. Not the U.S. way, not the Soviet way, some other way. And they very generously offered to lead that third way. Huh! Interesting. There weren't many takers. If you need that long story short, there was still some remnants of the French Empire. Though they had lost Indochina, it was crumbling. But the French really turned to language and trade to try to keep influence in many parts of the world, particularly in former colonies. But that, if you told somebody who didn't understand the Cold War, they would be like, well, that's what big powers do. But the French tried to claim it was a third way, and in its own way, it was a way that was not exactly the American or the Russian way. Good for them. And then there were 3 countries in Europe, countries of significance that were not didn't take sides. We have the Nordic country of Sweden, which has a kind of fundamentally I wouldn't say pro-American, but a kind of pro-Western European. It's basically aligned with the United States side, without formally joining some of the organizations. It's certainly much more afraid of the Soviet Union taking it over than the United States. Austria is also going to be neutralized. It doesn't take official sides. Its neighbor to the north, Germany, remember that was split. Well, if you don't remember, I'm telling you now, but we did talk about, we had this map up here about the breakup of Germany, and then there's the breakup of Berlin, and Austria is south and east. And it was neutral. It did not join NATO at the time. It wasn't part of the Warsaw Pact. And Switzerland, being Switzerland, it's going to rely on its high mountains. It's economically pro-Western, without a doubt. It's definitely in that camp. It's just not going to officially declare for itself. So it was kind of softly in the pro-Western camp, but officially it's not taking sides. So you have a movement of we would generally call developing countries that wanted to stay out of it. You had France, who I guess they wanted to stay out of it, but really just have a third way. Maybe not staying out of it altogether, but not going behind the Americans or the Soviets. And then we have the European neutrals. So that is developing, and they're just other actors to keep in mind. I mention it just for the sake of mentioning it. I think it is important to remember that sometimes, and even I will do this, we make it seem like everybody was either on one side or the other. That's just not true. There were many who were more of one thing or more of another thing, and some that were definitely in it, but there were a lot who did not love. They had no love for the kind of bipolar system. What contributed to the non-aligned movement, I think, is one of the major, if not the major, process going on in the early Cold War. And that is the process of decolonization. We tend to forget, I tend to forget, I won't assume that you do, maybe you always remember this, but Britain, France, some degree the Netherlands, Portugal as well, they're going to try to hang on to their colonies after the end of the Second World War. Who's not having it? The United States, the Soviet Union. Holy moly, they agree on something. They want to get rid of colonies. It's America because of our staunch anti-colonial past, because we were a colony and we get it, so you should have self-determination. The Soviets do it because those are all capitalist colonies. They should get rid of them. And those two can agree, and the United Nations has set up one of its other missions, it's got a few, is to oversee the end of colonialism. Beginning in the late 1950s and continuing through the mid-60s, it doesn't end there, but in that period, there are a number of countries that are turned over to independence. And the reasons don't need to concern us. Just know that it's happening, particularly in Africa. And not just sub-Saharan Africa, but North and sub-Saharan Africa. For those that already were not independent, independence comes quite rapidly to most, though not all. And what that makes the United States and the Soviet Union believe is that all these countries are now up for grabs, and given what they see as basically the two-camp global system, we either got to get them in our camp, or that's it. I mean, we got to get them in our camp. If not, they're going to somehow strengthen the other side. And like why that matters, up until this point, the United States had, when it came to military spending under Eisenhower, who's going to preside from January of 53 until January of 61, when JFK takes over. Excuse me here. Eisenhower was big on nuclear weapons, believing that they were generally a cheaper alternative. The phrase "more bang for the buck" is associated with this kind of thinking, and that there wouldn't be a need for a large conventional force. A conventional army is kind of your normal troops, planes, tanks, aircraft carriers, all that stuff. And then nuclear weapons are kind of treated as their own thing. And Eisenhower had generally supported their own thing, although we'll just leave it at that. He was generally of that mind. But now with decolonization, which really it gets started in mass at the end of Eisenhower's second term, and so he also doesn't really have to deal with it as much as his successor, who is John F. Kennedy. And Kennedy sees this, and he thinks the Soviets are going to make plays for those newly independent countries. A lot of them are economically weak. They were former colonies, and so their economies were set up to benefit the national. Sorry, not the national. They were set up to benefit the colonizer. And that's a strange set of economic institutions to have. And knowing that weakness, he figured the Soviets would try to lure these newly independent countries into the Soviet camp by promising them economic aid, something like that. And, the United States would make its counter pitch and could definitely foot the money. But in those cases where those leaders were in the communist camp, it might take military force, and Kennedy didn't think it would be politically palatable to go around nuking developing countries because they didn't want to renounce or denounce communism. And so a conventional force might be necessary. You might need some troops, planes, tanks, and so on. So he's going to call for a buildup of that. And once you have the troops, as is frequently the case, you start seeing new uses for them. But Kennedy is not preeminently preoccupied with Vietnam when he comes to office. He's actually more concerned about Laos, that country I mentioned before, the landlocked Laos up here. He's concerned about that, and even more pressing, though not terribly large, is Cuba. Why does he care about Cuba? Welp, it's communist. That's the short version. Fidel Castro and his merry band of guerrillas, insurgents, kicked the old dictator Fulgencio Batista out. They beat him and sent the regime packing, killed a number of them as well. Anyways, and let's see. Cuba's there. Miami's there. That's too close. And what the heck? Cuba just leapfrogged containment. Last we checked, communism was over here, and it was over here, and now it's 90 miles from Florida. Yikes. What to do. So, the Central Intelligence Agency, at the end of the Eisenhower administration, came up with a plan. They were training Cubans who had left when Castro took over, and they were training them outside of the country, and they were going to have them land in Cuba with U.S. Arms and training and even aerial support, and they were going to overthrow the Castro regime. Eisenhower didn't do it, surprisingly. Okay, it falls to Kennedy. Kennedy's a Democrat. Now, he's a conservative Democrat. He's a cold warrior to his mind. He is tough on communism, and boy, is he going to show it. And, you know, Castro's regime made themselves target by planting themselves so close. So, 1961, there is what we know as the Bay of Pigs invasion. The Cuban exiles were returning to Cuba, armed, equipped, trained, and all that. Okay. At the last moment, Kennedy decides not to send an American air cover, air support, because he thinks it'll make it look too obvious that this is an American-backed operation. And what he's worried about is that if he did that to a communist country, that the Soviet Union, I know it doesn't exist here, it's Russia, but the Soviet Union would retaliate somewhere in Europe, maybe in Asia again. He didn't know. He didn't want to find out. And so he wanted to have what we would call plausible deniability. No, it wasn't us. We weren't. No idea, but good riddance. Okay, it didn't work because the Cubans knew it was coming, and the lack of air support hurt, but really lacking the element of surprise. Also, the logic here is a bit fuzzy. The assumption was that once the exiles landed in Cuba, that the locals, as locals always do when they see armed men showing up out of the water, would greet them as liberators and join in overthrowing the Castro regime, which, by the way, had replaced the absolutely reprehensible Batista regime. I think the thought checker there needed to take one more pass at this plan, but it didn't, and it was a failure. And Kennedy now is worried that he's appearing weak on communism. My goodness, you can't even knock out the Castro regime. It's this close to you. What are you going to do if the Soviet Union attacks Germany? Or China, Soviet Union, whoever attacks Japan? Or there's another war in Korea? Like, what are you going to do then if you can't win this? However, though Castro survives this one, he thinks, well, yeah, Kennedy's not happy right now. And when he comes back, he's coming back and he's not holding back. It's going to be American regular army. And even if they know it's coming, the Cubans aren't going to be able to hold that off. And so he and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, which is over here, though it says Russia, they get a plan of their own, which is not really much smarter than the Bay of Pigs plan. But their plan is going to be to have the Soviet Union sneak in nuclear missiles, and they're going to be set up in Cuba. Now, for Castro, this is a great idea, because what he can threaten the Americans with is, look, you try to attack me again, I'm launching these missiles. And they had a range that could hit, if you can see where my cursor is, much of the southeast of the United States. United States finds out, kind of last minute, and Kennedy says, not going to allow that to happen. So we're either going to attack you before they get operational, or you can pull them out. Now, it looked like it was going to be war, but at the proverbial last moment, the Soviets and the Americans strike a deal. It's not a deal they strike with Castro, but once the Soviets have made the deal, they tell Castro, we're taking our missiles and we're going home. Castro is furious, but we promised the Soviets we would not invade the Castro regime. We wouldn't overthrow the Castro regime, so there was no need for the nuclear weapons anyhow. That was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. Soviet Union and the United States took a step back and said, we came really close to nuclear war right there, and that's what led them to install the hotline. That sometimes you see it looks like that red phone. The president's talking on. It's supposed to be a direct line to other leaders, because during the Cuban Missile Crisis, both sides found that the president of the United States could not reach the Soviet premier and vice versa. They had to go through other people. They didn't have direct communications, and so it led to the installation of the White House hotline. All right. Let's do the short version of this, even though I prefer the long version of so many of these things. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, Lyndon Baines Johnson. JFK is president until he's assassinated on November 22nd, 1963. So he's in office from January 61 until November of 63. By my count, what is that? 1, 2 years? He's not in office that long, although people tend to think that he was. Lyndon Baines Johnson was his vice president, took over when Kennedy was assassinated. Kennedy started out in Vietnam, and this actually works a little bit better. Once his attention was turned a bit from Laos to what was going on in neighboring Vietnam, it's under Kennedy that there's the initial buildup. There were a handful of advisors in Vietnam prior to Kennedy. Under Kennedy, there can be about 15,000 American. That's a excuse me, a lot of advisors for South Vietnam. Right, it was cut in half. We'll never know what would have happened if he lived. His aides have argued after the fact that Kennedy was about to pull everyone out of Vietnam, all the Americans out of Vietnam, and it was going to go its own way. I don't know. A lot of that was written later on when the war became unpopular and when the war was escalated. And, Kennedy's advisors, a lot of them, particularly because of the way he died, they wanted to portray him as positively as possible. And, when you're talking about what people would have done if they had lived, you can always speculate. We'll never know. Maybe he would have, but he was also the guy who already seriously escalated the American military commitment to Vietnam. Johnson he sees himself as kind of the second coming of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I don't know what it is with these three initial people, but anyways, he wants to do a lot domestically. Anti-poverty and addressing poverty, that's really Johnson's thing. Foreign policy, not his thing. He comes out of Congress, he went in the House, he went in the Senate. He's used to making deals in American domestic politics. But he understands enough about American domestic politics to know he's got to do something in Vietnam, because conservative Democrats and Republicans have the votes to stop what becomes Johnson's Great Society programs if he can't give them what they want. And what they want is the anti-communist war. They want war in Vietnam. They don't want to see South Vietnam go communist. And so Johnson said, all right, that's the price we got to pay for the Great Society. Then we'll escalate in Vietnam. I'm not trying to make him sound too detached about it, but there were a number of things, and there were other foreign policy issues. This one becomes a major one, no doubt about it. And it actually causes Johnson to decide in 1968, even though he could have ran for re-election, he announces in late March that he will not, and he tries to use the remaining years of his presidency, the remaining months of his presidency to end the Vietnam War. He does not do that. There's an interesting kind of history why. The short version is because, probably in violation of federal law, members of the Nixon administration reached out to the South Vietnamese government, who needed to sign off on the deal, and Johnson was preparing a kind of peace offer, and it might have worked. We'll never know. And the Nixon folks just convinced the South Vietnamese people to torpedo the deal. And they basically promised the South Vietnamese people, we'll do better for you than Johnson's deal. Just say no and we'll be in office soon, and then we'll take care of it. Okay. So it doesn't end under Johnson. But under Johnson, he's taken it from 17,000 military advisors under JFK to 500,000 men under him. I mean, that's a real serious escalation. We're seeing the draft brought back to get these kind of large numbers. And it is clear that now America has committed to this war. I mean, you don't send 500,000 troops as a kind of, we'll see how it goes. America's in, and they're in on keeping the South Vietnamese government independent of the North. Johnson's unable to end the war. Nixon comes to office, and for him, Vietnam is not the centerpiece. The centerpiece is the struggle with the Soviet Union. Let's see. How am I running on time? I am running over. Surprise. Nixon, Kissinger, and detente. All right. I want to talk about these. I don't want to rush them. So I can do them at the very beginning of the next lecture. We're going to talk about other things as we pivot to Unit 2. But I do want to make some concluding remarks about the time from 1968 to 1991. And I really, really will try to make it shorter that time. So we'll do that, and we will move on, continue with the reading schedule set out in the syllabus, and we will go from there.